In the opening years of the war, confidence seemed unshakable within the German officer corps. Victories had come quickly and decisively, Poland crushed in weeks, France collapsing in mere months, and the once proud British army driven from Dunkirk's beaches in disarray. Propaganda trumpeted these triumphs as proof of Germany's destiny, reinforcing the belief that the Reich was not only powerful but unstoppable. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and endless speeches painted a picture of inevitability. The world would bend to German might, and nothing could stand in its path. For a colonel who had marched through these campaigns, the atmosphere of certainty was intoxicating. He saw himself as part of a military machine that had achieved what his ancestors had only dreamed of. Tanks seemed invincible, aircraft unmatched, and the German soldier was portrayed as the model of discipline and courage. Every victory was celebrated not just as a success, but as further proof that history itself favored Germany. The officers dined on the rhetoric of destiny, convinced they were shaping a new world order. In Berlin, parades and speeches emphasized that even the greatest industrial powers could not compete. "The Americans are too soft," one speech declared. "They lack discipline, they lack unity. They are a divided people of consumers, not fighters." For the colonel, this belief was not questioned. It was repeated daily until it felt like truth. Yet beneath the pride lingered a shadow, the awareness that Germany's resources were finite, that war demanded more than victories on paper. Still, in these early years, arrogance drowned out doubt. Every setback could be explained away, every concern dismissed as weakness. The colonel's mind, like that of many officers, was shaped by propaganda into believing that the Reich was destined to rule. He could not yet imagine the moment when reality would shatter that illusion. The colonel's own career mirrored the narrative of German superiority. He had marched at the head of columns through French villages where doors and shutters were closed tight in fear. He had watched the tricolour pulled down and the swastika raised over once proud cities. Each campaign seemed to confirm what he had been taught, that the German soldier was unmatched in discipline, precision, and resolve. His memories of the French campaign were filled with moments that strengthened his conviction. He recalled how swiftly the vaunted Maginot Line had been bypassed, how the enemy retreated in confusion as German tanks advanced with mechanical certainty. He believed these victories were not accidents of strategy, but proof of an inherent German advantage. To him it seemed that while other nations relied on numbers, Germany relied on quality, better training, better planning, and a sense of destiny that no statistic could capture. The colonel carried these impressions with him into North Africa, where the Africa Corps pinned admiration even from their enemies. When supply lines faltered and conditions grew harsh, he still interpreted survival as evidence of superiority. If Germans could endure the desert and fight with limited resources, he reasoned, then surely no opponent could truly match them. This belief in superiority was not only military but cultural. He considered Germany a nation of order, of discipline, of efficiency, qualities he thought were absent in other countries. Propaganda reinforced these views daily, but his own experiences on the battlefield sealed them. At this point he could not imagine that all of these convictions, so deeply rooted, would one day be torn apart by what he would witness. The colonel's career was marked by a series of campaigns that etched themselves into his memory with both pride and scar. In France he had witnessed firsthand the stunning efficiency of the German advance. The campaign was swift, brutal, and decisive. He remembered long columns of French prisoners marching silently to the rear, their faces etched with disbelief that their powerful nation had collapsed in mere weeks. For the colonel, these moments became proof that German arms were destined for greatness. He carried the image of panzers racing across the countryside like thunder, leaving even seasoned officers astonished at the speed of victory. When his unit was transferred to North Africa, the challenges shifted but the sense of superiority remained. The desert was unforgiving with its endless stretches of sand, blistering heat, and nights that cut like knives. Yet the Africa Corps, under the leadership of Rommel, carved a reputation for ingenuity and resilience. The colonel admired how German troops repaired tanks in the open desert, fought with rationed supplies, and pressed forward against numerically superior forces. Victories at places like Tobruk and Gazala filled him with pride, reinforcing the belief that German discipline could triumph even in impossible conditions. The colonel also earned respect from his men, not through words but through his presence in the field. He marched alongside them, shared their meager rations, and endured the same hardships. When wounds and fatigue threatened to break their spirit, he steadied them with calm authority. His medals told only part of the story. It was his reputation as a soldier who endured alongside his men that cemented his standing. To his mind, these experiences proved that Germany's strength lay not only in weapons, but in the steel of its soldiers. Yet the shine of victory could not conceal the shadows that crept in after North Africa. The campaign that had once brought pride slowly revealed its fragility. In Tunisia, the colonel experienced what he had rarely felt before: defeat on a scale that stripped away illusion. Supplies dwindled to nothing, fuel became a treasure, and soldiers fought not with confidence but with desperation. He saw men reduced to shadows of themselves, their once proud uniforms stained with dust and exhaustion, their eyes dulled by hunger. The Afrika Korps, celebrated for its resilience, had been stretched beyond endurance. The colonel remembered watching tanks that once symbolized unstoppable power standing silent, their fuel tanks dry. He recalled airfields littered with wrecked aircraft and soldiers scavenging for food among the ruins of abandoned outposts. Each day brought reports of another unit encircled, another battalion forced to surrender. What had once been a theater of triumph became a slow collapse. For the first time, the colonel felt the weight of doubt pressing against his convictions. If German superiority was absolute, why did their strength wither so quickly against the relentless pressure of Allied logistics? Why did American convoys seem endless while his own men starved? The propaganda he had trusted so completely no longer answered these questions. The surrender of 250,000 Axis troops in Tunisia marked not just a military defeat, but a psychological one. The colonel carried the humiliation heavily. He could still hear the silence that followed Rommel's replacement, the sense among officers that the myth of invincibility had cracked. He did not say it aloud, but in his private thoughts he wondered, had they underestimated the enemy far too deep? The colonel's doubts deepened when defeat carried him not back to Germany, but into captivity. Loaded onto transport ships with thousands of other prisoners, he braced himself for humiliation and hardship. In his mind, captivity meant cattle cars, chains, and rations barely fit for survival. Yet what he encountered challenged everything he expected. Instead of dark, overcrowded wagons, he stepped into passenger coaches with cushioned seats and space to breathe. Guards issued instructions in firm but respectful tones, and there was no attempt to strip prisoners of dignity beyond the loss of freedom itself. At first he was certain it was a trick, propaganda designed to weaken their morale. But the longer the journey continued, the more unsettling the reality became. Meals arrived regularly, consisting of white bread, coffee, and meat. These were not occasional gestures but part of a routine. Compared to the crusts and watery soup he had endured in the desert, the food seemed absurdly generous. He noticed younger soldiers staring in disbelief at plates set before them, whispering that even at home in Germany, such abundance was rare. The colonel watched carefully, searching for cracks that might reveal deception. Yet the American guards behaved with the calm assurance of men who found nothing unusual in this treatment. When one sergeant apologized that the air conditioning in the train cars wasn't functioning properly, the colonel felt a strange disorientation. Air conditioning, something he had only heard existed for the highest German officials, was here offered to prisoners as though it were an inconvenience if absent. What unsettled him most was the normality of it all. Comfort was not staged for display, it was woven into the fabric of everyday life. For the first time he sensed that Germany might not understand the scale of the nation it was fighting. The realization did not yet crystallize into certainty, but the first cracks in his confidence had opened. As the train rolled deeper into the American heartland, the contrast with Germany's wartime reality became impossible to ignore. Through the wide observation windows, the colonel saw entire towns illuminated late into the night, every street corner glowing with electric light. In Germany, blackout regulations had plunged cities into darkness for years, yet here even the smallest communities shimmered with energy as if the war scarcely existed. Factories hummed at full capacity, their chimneys marking the skyline in every direction. Parking lots overflowed with automobiles, not the rare privilege of party officials, but the everyday possession of ordinary workers. Each vehicle represented a level of prosperity that German propaganda had always denied, insisting America was collapsing under the weight of decadence. What the colonel saw was the opposite, a society so wealthy that abundance appeared casual. The soldiers around him pressed their faces to the glass, whispering comparisons that grew more bitter with each mile. They remembered their families standing in long lines for bread, rationing butter to the last gram, saving scraps of coal through brutal winters. In contrast, here they saw shop windows lit brightly at midnight, groceries stocked and trains fueled with effortless efficiency. The colonel could not deny the disbelief tightening in his chest. The differences were not subtle, they were overwhelming. Germany fought for survival through scarcity, yet America seemed to overflow with resources, even while supplying distant battlefronts. What he glimpsed in those brief hours was more damaging to his certainty than any enemy soldier's bullet. It was the quiet, unshakable evidence that his nation's vision of inevitable victory was built on illusion. When the prisoners were transferred from the port to trains bound for inland camps, the colonel braced himself for the kind of treatment Germany reserved for captives: cramped boxcars, rough benches, and days of misery on steel wheels. Instead, he stepped into a different world. The carriages were Pullman passenger cars, vehicles of comfort, not cruelty. Cushioned seats lined the aisles, wide enough for men to sit without being pressed shoulder to shoulder. Overhead racks held their belongings, and the windows provided sweeping views of the countryside. At first the colonel thought it was some kind of mistake. Surely these were not meant for prisoners. Yet guards directed them with calm precision, as though this was entirely normal. Soon dining cars were attached, and the men were led to tables covered with white cloth. Plates of food were placed before them with silver cutlery. The colonel picked up the fork, his hand unsteady, as he tried to reconcile the scene with his expectations. Prisoners eating like paying travelers, such a thing seemed absurd. In Germany, even civilians who supported the war effort would have considered such luxuries unimaginable. Passenger cars had long been reserved for officers or the wealthy. Dining cars were rarities, often stripped from the rail system to prioritize military cargo. Yet here prisoners of war were provided with comforts that many German citizens had never experienced in their lives. As the train rolled smoothly across the rails, the colonel leaned back into the padded seat. A strange mixture of relief and unease swept over him. He was not being degraded, but cared for with a matter-of-fact confidence that unsettled him more than cruelty could have. America's luxury, offered casually even to its enemies, was its own kind of power. The first meal served in captivity left the colonel more shaken than any defeat in the field. He had prepared himself for rations little better than scraps, watery soup, perhaps a crust of bread, the kind of fare Germany reserved for its own prisoners. Instead, the guards delivered plates piled with white bread so soft it almost crumbled in his hands. Alongside it came thick slices of meat, steaming and seasoned, accompanied by real butter and glasses of milk so cold that condensation beaded the surface. The younger soldiers stared in silence, some too stunned to eat at first. For months they had survived on meager portions, their stomachs never truly full. In Africa they had counted themselves fortunate to receive a piece of dried sausage, or a handful of beans. Now before their eyes was more food than an entire squad had shared in a week. The colonel took a cautious bite, expecting some hidden trick, but it was simple, ordinary nourishment, ordinary for America, though extraordinary to men raised in scarcity. Whispers spread quickly along the tables. Is this a special show? Some wondered. Others muttered that it must be propaganda, a staged display meant to soften their resolve. But the guards were indifferent. They served the meals without ceremony, chatting among themselves, unconcerned whether the prisoners were impressed or not. This was routine, nothing more. The colonel chewed slowly, his mind racing. If the Americans could feed their prisoners with such abundance, what must their own soldiers be receiving at the front? The realization struck like a blow. In Germany, civilians and troops alike endured constant shortages, while here even enemies dined on meat, bread and milk without hesitation. It was not luxury, it was normal life. That truth unsettled him most of all. The colonel's true awakening began not in the fields or camps, but at the docks. As he and his fellow prisoners waited for transport across the Atlantic, Their eyes fell upon massive ships that seemed to multiply like steel giants along the shoreline. These were Liberty ships, cargo vessels the Americans produced with astonishing speed. At first the colonel dismissed the stories whispered by guards. A ship built in only a few days. Impossible. In Germany, even the most efficient shipyards labored for months, sometimes years, to complete a vessel. But the evidence was undeniable. Posters displayed the record. The SS Robert E. Peary built in just over 4 days from keel to launch. The colonel studied the details, convinced it must be propaganda. Yet American sailors confirmed it casually, speaking of it as a matter of pride, but not miracle. For them, speed of construction was expected, not extraordinary. The colonel watched cranes moving with relentless rhythm, hoisting prefabricated sections into place as if assembling a child's toy. Welders worked around the clock, sparks lighting the night sky. Supplies arrived by rail, by truck, by conveyor belt, all feeding into a process so smooth it appeared mechanical. Each part came from a different state, each piece fitting seamlessly into the whole. What shook the colonel most was not the scale of the ships themselves, but the frequency of their birth. 3 new vessels launched every single day at the peak of production. In Germany, entire shipyards could not match such output in a year. Standing at the docks, he realized that the war was not simply being fought with soldiers and tanks, but with factories, cranes and an industrial engine his country could never hope to match. For the first time, he wondered if defeat was inevitable. When the colonel's transport finally reached the American coast, the scale of what unfolded before his eyes left him silent. Norfolk Naval Base stretched for miles, a sprawl of cranes, warehouses, and docks that dwarfed anything he had ever seen in Europe. The German port of Hamburg, once considered mighty, seemed like a provincial harbor in comparison. Here dozens of cargo ships stood side by side, each one being loaded or unloaded simultaneously, as if the sea itself had opened to pour resources onto America's shore. He watched cranes swing effortlessly, hoisting entire freight containers with a single motion, machines doing in minutes what German laborers required hours to accomplish with ropes and muscle. Longshoremen moved with practiced efficiency, supported by electric-powered machinery that ran without pause. The sheer orchestration of it all gave the impression not of struggle, but of abundance. An economy so vast it could feed, arm, and transport millions without strain. The colonel noticed details that struck harder than any statistic. Workers smoked casually while unloading endless crates of food. Automobiles filled the parking lots outside the docks, each belonging to ordinary laborers. He thought of German families scraping for coal and bread, while here common dock workers lived with conveniences German officers could not dream of. The image seared into his mind was not just one of ships or cranes, but of limitless supply chains, stretching back into a continent overflowing with resources. This was not the desperation of a nation fighting for survival. It was the confidence of a society whose power appeared bottomless. The colonel could not look away, for in that moment awe began to replace denial. As the colonel and his men were marched past bustling American towns, it was not military might that unsettled them most. It was ordinary life. Outside the factories and rail yards, parking lots overflowed with cars, each one polished and waiting for its owner to drive home. The colonel counted them instinctively, unable to believe that these belonged to workers, not officers or elites. In Germany, even the most privileged families dreamed of the Volkswagen that had been promised, but rarely delivered. Here, a dockhand or machinist owned not only one vehicle but sometimes 2. Clothing too told its story. American workers strolled in sturdy leather boots, warm coats, and clean shirts, the kind of garments that in Germany would have cost a month's wages or been rationed beyond reach. Yet these men wore them casually, smoking cigarettes and chatting as if abundance were the most natural thing in the world. Shops along the main streets sparkled with goods. Windows displayed radios, refrigerators, and household appliances that German officers had only seen in catalogues. To the prisoners, even these glimpses felt surreal. They remembered their families back home queuing for coal or bartering for soap, while here the simplest store seemed stocked beyond imagination. The colonel's envy mixed with an uneasy admiration. This wealth was not paraded as a weapon but carried with a quiet confidence, as though it required no explanation. Ordinary workers lived lives richer than the German elite, and they did so in the midst of war. That realization struck harder than gunfire. America's strength was not only its armies or its factories, but the everyday prosperity of its people. It was proof that a society of free citizens could outmatch a dictatorship built on control. The colonel's reflections deepened as he compared what he witnessed in America to the lives of Germany's elite. Back home, high-ranking officers and party officials enjoyed privileges far above ordinary citizens, cars, fine meals, and rare luxuries. But even these paled beside what America's workers seemed to take for granted. In Germany, a roast dinner was a special event reserved for festivals or favored guests. Here he saw it served casually in roadside diners, eaten by men in overalls who had just finished their shifts. The contrast cut sharply. German propaganda had painted American society as chaotic, divided and weak. Yet the evidence before his eyes told another story. Ordinary citizens were not starving. They were thriving. They lived in homes with electricity, running water and radios, while German civilians rationed every crumb, every drop of fuel, every piece of clothing. He could not escape the realization democracy, for all its supposed flaws, had created a society where average people lived better than Germany's ruling class. At first, the colonel resisted this conclusion. It clashed with everything he had been taught to believe. But denial grew impossible as each day revealed more of the same truth. The guards escorting him were not nobles or party men, they were regular soldiers, often younger and less decorated than him, yet they carried themselves with the assurance of men who came from a land that lacked nothing. Quiet respect began to replace resentment. This was not weakness, it was strength of a different kind. America's prosperity rested not on privilege but on the collective power of free citizens. The colonel realized that in such a society victory was not just possible, it was inevitable. The colonel's greatest shock came not from what he saw in the towns, but from what unfolded inside America's factories. Escorted through an industrial hub, he expected to witness only a fraction of what German propaganda had claimed was sloppy and inefficient production. Instead, he found himself staring at a world that upended everything he thought he knew. The factory never slept. Day and night, machines thundered without pause, conveyor belts clattered, and furnaces roared as thousands of workers pushed production forward in 3 relentless shifts. In Germany, even the most vital plants slowed at night or were forced to operate under blackout regulations. Here, entire complexes glowed like cities, lit by electricity that seemed endless. The sheer energy pulsing through those walls made it clear this was not desperation, it was unstoppable momentum. More unsettling than the scale was the diversity of the workforce. Women in coveralls stood shoulder to shoulder with men welding steel, operating cranes and running drilling machines. Young women guided heavy machinery with practiced ease, their faces streaked with sweat and sparks dancing around. Alongside them, African American and immigrant workers moved with equal authority, commanding equipment that German doctrine insisted only trained specialists could manage. The colonel felt the weight of contradiction press against his chest. He had been told that democracies were weak because they gave everyone a voice, that women and minorities were incapable of handling complex tasks, that only the disciplined German man could carry industry forward. Yet here he was watching the impossible unfold before his eyes, thousands working together with precision, efficiency and pride. The noise of the machines became a drumbeat in his mind. If this was democracy's weakness, he thought grimly, then Germany had no chance. The propaganda had lied. Reality was undeniable. The colonel's disbelief only deepened when he learned the numbers. One American steel mill could outproduce entire regions of Germany. At Republic Steel in Ohio, for instance, blast furnaces roared day and night, churning out 10,000 tons of steel daily. The figure staggered him. 10,000 tons, what Germany struggled to achieve across multiple plants. America achieved in a single location and often with fewer men because machines did so much of the labor. He remembered the Ruhr Valley, once Germany's proud industrial hub. Its plants worked under constant shortages, air raids, and crumbling infrastructure. Workers there slaved for hours to coax limited results, often recycling scrap because new resources were scarce. Yet here in America, raw materials arrived in endless trains, feeding furnaces that never cooled. The scale alone was enough to crush the imagination. And this was not exceptional. The colonel learned that across the country dozens of such facilities matched or even exceeded these figures. Aircraft factories produced hundreds of planes per month. Automobile plants converted into military production were building tanks and engines with breathtaking speed. What Germany considered impossible was routine for America. Standing inside one of these complexes, the colonel felt dwarfed, as though he were witnessing a force of nature rather than human industry. Endless stacks of raw steel, machines hammering without pause, workers moving like parts of a living organism. It all spoke of a power that could not be stopped. For the first time he understood the true scale of the enemy. Germany had gambled against an industrial colossus, and it was already too late. The breaking point for the colonel came not with the sight of ships or factories, but with something far simpler: food. On the transport ships he had already watched American sailors toss half-eaten steaks into trash bins, or pour milk overboard because it had sat out too long. At first he convinced himself it was staged, a cruel performance meant to demoralize prisoners. But as days turned into weeks, he realized it was simply habit. Waste was so ordinary that no one thought twice. In Germany, every crumb was accounted for. Families scraped plates clean, saved stale bread for soup, and measured flour by the ounce. Soldiers wrote home begging for food parcels, while civilians stood in ration lines for hours to collect meager portions. The colonel remembered his wife's letters, describing how she watered down soup to make it last for 2 days, and how their children shared a single apple. To see Americans discarding food that would have sustained his family for a week was unbearable. When he was later assigned to camp kitchen duties, the reality hit even harder. American regulations required cooks to prepare more than needed, so that no prisoner went hungry. Whatever was left over was thrown away, regardless of quality. Perfect loaves of bread, bowls of potatoes, trays of meat, all discarded because abundance demanded no caution. The colonel stood over the trash bins, hands trembling, as he realized he was throwing away food his own children might never taste again. Shame and collapse washed over him. The propaganda of German superiority crumbled completely. America's true strength was not only its machines, but its ability to feed its people, and even its enemies without hesitation. That was a power Germany could never match. If the discarded food had broken the colonel's pride, Christmas shattered what remained of his bitterness. At the camp, word spread quickly that the holiday would be marked with a special meal. Many prisoners assumed it was another deception, a token gesture for appearances. But when the day arrived, the reality surpassed imagination. Long tables were laid out in the mess hall, covered with dishes the colonel had not seen since before the war: roast turkey, glazed ham, potatoes piled high, vegetables in abundance, pies of every flavor, and even ice cream. The guards reassured them that this was not an exception, not staged for their benefit. This was simply the American Christmas dinner, the same meal being served in homes across the country. The colonel ate until he could eat no more, overwhelmed not only by the food but by the spirit in which it was given. Volunteers from nearby churches sent cakes and cookies, while children delivered handmade cards wishing their enemies a blessed Christmas. A choir from the town came to sing carols in German, their voices filling the cold barracks with warmth. The colonel could not reconcile what he was experiencing. These were enemies whose sons were fighting against his own countrymen, yet they showed kindness instead of hatred. It was not propaganda, it was genuine humanity. For the first time since his capture, he felt something stir that he had thought war had buried forever: hope. That night, lying in his bunk, the colonel admitted to himself what he would never have confessed months. A system that treated enemies with dignity and mercy was stronger than one built on fear, and perhaps he thought it was worth respecting. The colonel's final realization began with the news of Normandy. At first it arrived as whispers among the prisoners. An invasion had begun on the French coast. Many dismissed it as rumor, a hopeful story planted by American guards. But soon confirmation arrived in the form of newsreels projected on camp walls. The colonel sat rigid as the flickering images filled the screen. What unfolded before him was not an assault. It was a tidal wave. 6,000 ships filled the seas, their decks lined with men and equipment. He saw wave after wave of landing craft pour across the beaches, unloading tanks, trucks and soldiers with mechanical precision. Overhead the skies swarmed with aircraft, more than 11,000 of them blotting out the horizon. He had never seen so many machines of war in a single place, not even during Germany's greatest offensives. The logistics were what broke him. Artificial harbors floated off the beaches, their cranes already unloading supplies as though permanent ports had sprung from the waves over. Fuel pipelines snaked across the seabed, delivering lifeblood directly to the front lines. The commentary announced that 15,000 tons of material were being delivered every day on open beaches under fire, yet still with the efficiency of a factory assembly line. The colonel's throat tightened. He thought of Germany's supply lines, fragile and overextended, their armies forced to ration ammunition, fuel and even food. Compared to this spectacle, Germany's war machine seemed like a toy set against a giant. As the film ended, the colonel knew the truth could no longer be denied. Germany was not simply losing, it had already lost. The scale of American power was beyond anything he had imagined, and no amount of courage or loyalty could change. If Normandy had broken the colonel's belief in Germany's strength, the next revelation shattered his faith in its honor. One evening the guards gathered prisoners in the hall and played reels from liberated territories. The colonel expected more images of tanks and soldiers. Instead, the screen flickered with something he could scarcely comprehend: concentration camps. The camera moved through barbed wire fences into a world of starvation and death. Emaciated figures stared blankly at the lens, their eyes hollow, their bodies reduced to shadows of light. Rows of corpses lay stacked like firewood, the evidence undeniable, impossible to dismiss. The colonel shifted in his seat, hands trembling. This was not propaganda. He could see American soldiers in the frames, their faces stricken with disgust and grief. He could hear their voices as they explained what they had found. The colonel remembered the speeches that had promised Germany was fighting for civilization, for a greater destiny. Now, staring at the images of cruelty carried out in the name of that destiny, he felt only his chest tightened as he thought of the discipline, loyalty, and sacrifice he had once been proud of. Was it all for this? When the lights came back on, silence filled the room. No one argued, no one whispered excuse. The prisoners sat like stone, crushed not by defeat on the battlefield, but by moral collapse. For the colonel, it was the moment he realized Germany was doomed not just militarily, but spiritually. The cause he had served was not merely lost, it was corrupt beyond redemption. By 1945, as the war drew to its bloody close, the colonel and thousands of other German prisoners faced a new journey, returning home. They boarded trains not as conquering soldiers, but as men transformed by what they had seen. The memories of abundance, efficiency, and unexpected kindness followed them like shadows. For the colonel, each passing mile carried him further from captivity, but deeper into reflection. He thought of the Liberty ships built in days, the factories running without pause, the shelves of American stores brimming with goods. He remembered the way ordinary workers lived lives richer than Germany's elite, and how even prisoners had been fed with more dignity than his own family back home. These were not illusions, they were lessons etched into his memory, impossible to unlearn. As the transport crossed into a war-torn Europe, the contrast struck with brutal clarity. Cities lay in ruins, farmland gutted, people gaunt with hunger. Germany had gambled everything on conquest, and now had nothing left. Yet the colonel no longer felt only despair. The vision of America's strength suggested a different possibility. Prosperity could be built not on domination, but on cooperation. When the prisoners finally stepped onto German soil, many carried more than their belongings. They carried knowledge. They spoke quietly to neighbors of electric lights in every home, of factories run by women, of schools open to all. The colonel, once certain of Germany's destiny, now understood that the future depended on building rather than destroying. In that sense, captivity had not ended his story, it had given him a new one. For the first time he returned home not as a warrior, but as a witness to what a society could become when it chose creation over conquest. The colonel's realization did not fade with the end of captivity, it became the legacy of his life. Back in Germany he found a nation broken, its cities hollowed by fire, its people haunted by loss. Yet within that devastation the lessons carried from America glowed like embers waiting to ignite. He had seen a system where prosperity flowed from freedom, where workers were valued, where diversity strengthened rather than weakened. Now he believed those principles could rebuild what war had destroyed. The colonel quietly shared what he had witnessed. He told young men that a single American farmer harvested more than entire German villages, not because of racial superiority, but because of technology and trust in progress. He spoke to neighbors of factories run by women and minorities, proving that talent mattered more than ideology. And when he described how enemies had treated him with dignity, People listened with astonishment. These stories, repeated in thousands of towns by returning prisoners, became part of the foundation of West Germany's rebirth. They shaped minds open to democracy, encouraged reforms, and helped dismantle illusions of past glory. The colonel's moment of realization, once a private collapse of faith, grew into a collective acceptance that the future had to be different. When the Marshall Plan arrived, he was among those who embraced it, seeing not humiliation but opportunity. As West Germany rose into an economic miracle, the colonel recognized in every new bridge, school and factory the echo of lessons first learned in captivity. His journey revealed that true strength lay not in conquest but in cooperation, not in fear but in freedom. And in that understanding, he and countless others helped turn defeat into redemption and enemies into allies.